The fluorescent lights hummed their metallic song as Rachel Torres clocked into Oak Creek Memorial at 6:08 a.m. on a humid Monday in Savannah, her scrubs pressed with the same precision she'd once ironed into navy dress whites. The fabric hung crisp against her frame, not a wrinkle, not a thread out of place. She moved through the cardiac unit's double doors like someone passing through a checkpoint she'd already cleared 1,000 times, efficient, invisible, unremarkable. That was the point. That had always been the point. Dr. Sterling watched from the physician's lounge on the 3rd floor, his gaze tracking her from behind a half-empty coffee mug that read "World's Best Cardiologist" in ironic gold lettering. He didn't know her name yet. Just knew her as the temp, the fill-in from the staffing agency that had called Thursday with an urgent need. His jaw tightened as he observed the way she checked the cardiac monitors without having to be shown, the way her hands moved across fur lines with the certainty of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, not her first week. She wore no jewelry except a small watch with a military face, the kind that told time in 24-hour increments. Her shoes were practical, scuffed, the kind that had logged serious miles. Sterling's concern wasn't about competence. It was about questions. For 18 months, he'd been running a system through the cardiac unit that would have impressed a forensic accountant if anyone had been looking closely enough. Phantom procedures. Inflated billables. A Medtronic rep who owed him favors. A billing coordinator named Jacobs who split the overage with him, nothing large enough to trigger audits, just enough to fund his Lexus payment and the down payment on a vacation home in Hilton Head. $12,000 a month, steady, clean, invisible. But competent staff asked questions. Attentive staff noticed patterns. And this temp nurse, this woman in the pressed scrubs who moved like she'd trained for something more serious than bedside manner, had the look of someone who would notice. He made a note on his tablet, escalate her rotation. See what cracks. Rachel's hands moved on their own as she worked, muscle memory written into her nervous system by 8 years and 247 days of active service, she still counted, would always count, and the kind of training that lived in your ligaments. She adjusted a patient's oxygen flow, checked the cardiac strip on monitor 4, documented vitals in the EMR without looking at the keyboard. The work was simple. The muscle memory was dangerous. It was precisely the kind of routine efficiency that made people wonder who you really were. In her locker, shoved behind a spare pair of shoes and a plastic container of lunch she wouldn't eat, sat a faded unit patch. Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, the eagle and trident barely visible on fabric the color of old sand. She'd sewn it into the jacket lining before she arrived in Savannah 3 weeks ago, insurance. A reminder. Proof that she wasn't always just a nurse. She touched it once before every shift, her fingers finding the stitches in the dark, and whispered something that wasn't quite a prayer. The scar tissue on her forearms caught the locker light when she reached up. 3 parallel marks from a scalding 4 bag at Walter Reed. 1 long ridge along her right palm from glass at Landstuhl. These were the stories she carried under her scrubs, the one she'd learned to hide. They ran deep. The morning shift progressed without friction. Rachel moved through the unit with a kind of presence that people didn't quite register, the way you don't notice a perfectly functioning machine. She was there. She worked. She existed on the edges of conversations. By 11:41 a.m., Dr. Sterling had moved on to his first surgical consultation. The temp was a non-issue. Probably. Then the laceration came in around 1:15 p.m. Bay 7. A 63-year-old man visiting his daughter from Charleston had taken a fall outside the parking garage. 2-inch laceration across the left temporal region, bleeding controlled, no signs of skull fracture on palpation. The ER attending, a younger doctor named Reeves, cleaned the wound and called for sutures. "Get me a 1/0 nylon on a curved needle," he said, washing his hands. Standard 3-layer closure. Rachel was already moving. She'd gathered the tray before Reeves finished speaking, the instruments in their sterile order, the suture material, the syringe with lidocaine. She set it beside the patient with the silence of someone who'd done this under circumstances that made a controlled ER bay look like a resort. What happened next took 6 minutes. She began with the deep layer, the galea, the tough connective tissue beneath the skin. Her needle went in at a 45-degree angle, precise, the kind of angle that only came from having stitched flesh in the dark under the whistle and percussion of mortar fire. Her hands didn't shake. The needle came out on the opposite side of the wound with mechanical perfection. 1 stitch. 2. 3. Each one equidistant, each one the exact same depth. The patient watched her face, the way people do, trying to understand what they were seeing. There was something about the way her hands moved, not tentative, not uncertain, but absolutely, completely certain. Like muscle memory that had survived 1,000 miles and 3 continents. The subcutaneous layer. Smaller needle, finer suture. The skin layer, where precision became art. She worked with the focused intensity of someone for whom a loose stitch meant bleeding out. Her breathing never changed. Her jaw didn't clench. The world outside the 6-inch field of her attention simply ceased to exist. An older man stood in the doorway of Bay 7. Combat medic insignia on his jacket, faded, but readable. Name tape, Clayton. He'd come to pick up his daughter, a pediatric resident, and had stopped to watch the ER activity. 30 seconds. That's all it took for him to see what Rachel was doing. The coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. His face went the color of something that had been underwater for too long. He stared at Rachel's hands, at the 3-layer closure, at the technique that wasn't taught in nursing school but in a place with sand that got into everything and mortar that came without warning. His coffee cup continued to his lips, but his eyes never left the wound. Clayton whispered something. So quiet the patient almost didn't hear it. Sanjin. Rachel didn't look up. She tied the final knot with the kind of tension that came from having learned to be economical with suture material in places where resupply helicopters couldn't guarantee arrival. Her hands moved on. Remove the needle. Count the stitches, 14 total. Note the closure in the chart. She set the instruments down with the click of metal on metal, the only sound she made. Clayton turned away. He found his daughter in the hallway and pulled her aside, his voice sharp now, urgent. Rachel heard the words from Bay 7, that nurse. Where did she come from? Who is she? Dr. Sterling heard it too. He was reviewing a chart 3 bays over, standing close enough to catch the shift in tone, the weight behind Clayton's question. He watched through the partial glass partition as the older medic gestured back toward Bay 7, as his daughter's face changed from confusion to something else, something like recognition. The temp nurse was finishing her documentation. Quiet. Unobtrusive. Moving on to the next task. Sterling set his tablet down slowly. He opened his phone. The number for the scheduling coordinator answered on the second ring. Jessica. Sterling. I need you to adjust the temp nurse's rotation for the next 2 weeks. Rachel Torres. I want her on nights and weekends. Double shifts if she'll take them. Give her the hardest assignments. The post-op cardiac patients. The unstable cases. He paused, his voice dropping into something that wasn't quite a smile. Let's see how long she lasts. Jessica hesitated. That's pretty aggressive for a first-week temp. I'm being thorough, Sterling said. Quality assurance. He hung up before she could argue. On the other side of the hospital, in Bay 7, Rachel was already moving to the next patient, the unit patch in her locker still warm from her morning ritual, and Clayton was sitting in his car trying to remember exactly what year he'd been in Sanjin, and whether it was possible that he'd actually seen her there, that the stories people told about the medic called Reaper weren't stories at all. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling was already making a second phone call, this one to a contact at the billing department, his voice carrying the kind of casual threat that came from 18 months of getting away with something. Make sure we don't leave anything loose, he said quietly. Nothing that would prompt questions. Audit the last 6 months of my procedures. Tighten it up. If someone starts digging, I want everything clean. Rachel Torres had no idea that she'd just painted a target on herself with a 3-layer suture technique. She had no idea that Sterling had already begun calculating how to remove her before she could become a problem. All she knew was that the old medic had recognized something in her hands that she'd spent 3 weeks trying to bury in Savannah's humid anonymity. The shift ended at 7 that evening. Rachel clocked out and walked to her truck, a 2008 Ford Ranger parked in the back lot, the kind of vehicle that didn't draw attention. The humidity had thickened. Rain was coming, the kind that would hammer the asphalt like applause. She sat in the driver's seat for exactly 3 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, her breathing steady, her composure absolute. Then she reached into her locker, yes, she'd come back, she always checked, and touched the unit patch one more time. Muscle memory was a dangerous thing. Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of humidity that made the cardiac unit feel like an operating room slowly filling with water. Rachel had already completed her shift assessment, 3 post-op patients stable, 2 new admits prepped for echocardiograms, medication dispensing logged at 06 for 7, before Dr. Sterling pushed through the cafeteria doors at 0815 with 4 residents trailing like remoras behind a shark. The cafeteria was mid-breakfast rush. 70 people. Maybe 80. Attending physicians at the corner tables, residents clustered near the coffee station, nurses scattered across the middle section trying to grab 15 minutes before the day swallowed them whole. The fluorescent ceiling lights cast everyone in the same institutional pallor. Rachel sat 3 tables from the entry, a container of yogurt and berries in front of her, reading discharge summaries on a borrowed tablet. She'd learned not to occupy space noticeably. Shadows were safer than visibility. Sterling's voice cut through the ambient noise like a scalpel through tissue. "I'm starting a pool," he announced, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. His residents laughed on cue. "How long before the little temp quits?" "My money says Friday. Close of business. She'll have folded by then." One of the residents, a second year with expensive watch and the kind of jaw that had never known consequence, raised his hand. "What if she makes it, sir?" "She won't." Sterling smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Give me odds, though." "Tuesday of next week?" Everybody chips in 20. More laughter. The betting pool spread across the tables like ripples on still water. Nobody looked at Rachel. Nobody needed to. She was supposed to feel the weight of their dismissal the way she was supposed to fold under pressure, apologize for existing, and move to the next available catastrophe. That was the script they'd written for her. Her jaw tightened. Imperceptibly. Just the muscles along the hinge going rigid for 2 seconds before she released them. She kept her eyes on the tablet. By 13:30, during afternoon rounds, Sterling had moved from social theater to direct sabotage. He found her at the nursing station reviewing the cardiac patient charts for the 3 o'clock medication cycle. The corridor was narrow here, by design, probably, some architect's idea of efficiency, and Rachel stood precisely where she'd pulled the charts, not blocking anything, just existing in the space her job required. "You're in the way, sweetheart," Sterling said. His voice had the texture of oil poured over gravel. She stepped aside immediately. To the left. 2 steps. Giving him 4 feet of clear passage where he only needed 2. He passed her, then stopped. Turned back. The lunch tray was on the counter beside her, salad in a clear plastic container, minestrone soup in a paper cup, a roll wrapped in foil. She'd made it herself that morning. The kitchen in her apartment was small and sterile and had never seen anything like comfort. The rhythm of preparing food, the predictability of it, was a meditation she couldn't afford to admit she needed. Sterling's hand came up. He swept the tray from the counter with the casual precision of someone who'd practiced cruelty until it was muscle memory. It crashed to the floor. Salad scattered across 7 feet of tile in a spray pattern like shrapnel. The soup cup split on impact, minestrone spreading in a dark red pool. The roll bounced twice and rolled against the baseboard. The plastic container skittered across the floor and wedged under a chair. The cardiac unit went silent. 23 people. Rachel counted them in the seconds of silence. 23 people bearing witness. Sterling grabbed her patient charts from the station, the medication documentation, the post-operative notes, the vitals she'd recorded with precision that morning, and hurled them after the tray. Paper scattered like confetti, landing in the soup, sliding through salad, adhering to her shoes. The destruction took 3 seconds. Perfect. Choreographed. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice the color of honey poured over broken glass. "Unless cleaning is also beyond your skill set." He walked away. Rachel took one measured breath. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when it came, wouldn't shake either. Those were things she'd learned in desert compounds where the only mercy was discipline. But her eyes betrayed her. A single tear escaped down her right cheek. Just one. The kind that looks like a mistake, like weakness, like the breaking point everyone was waiting for. She crouched to gather the scattered papers. The tear rolled down her face as she knelt on the cold tile. She didn't wipe it immediately. Let it hang there for a fraction of a second, enough for anyone watching to think they'd won. Enough for Sterling's back to relax as he moved away. Then she wiped her cheek against her shoulder without breaking eye contact with his shoes, the Italian leather with the scuff mark on the left toe where he'd kicked something once. "I've cleaned up worse messes than you could imagine, doctor," she said. Her voice was quiet. Steady. The kind of calm that doesn't crack because it's been welded together in places that don't have names. She said it to his shoes because looking up at his face would have been a threat, and she wasn't allowed to threaten anyone. Not yet. Not with her real voice. Sterling's stride hesitated. Just barely. Just enough to tell her that something in those 8 words had registered as unfamiliar. He didn't turn back. He just continued toward the physician's lounge, his pace unchanged but his shoulders carrying a fraction more tension than before. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the unit slowly resumed breathing. Nurses began moving again. A resident coughed. The machines resumed their mechanical rhythms. Reality reasserted itself. Rachel gathered the papers with the same precision she used for everything else, surgical efficiency, no wasted motion, every document aligned and ordered by patient name and date. The salad went into the trash in handfuls. The soup she wiped from the floor with paper towels, containing the damage, leaving no trace. By 1347, it was as if the destruction had never happened. The only evidence was the dampness on her scrubs where the liquid had splashed. But that wasn't the worst part. By Thursday, Sterling had activated his second tier of sabotage. He'd reassigned her to the night rotation, double coverage on the understaffed cardiac unit, back-to-back 12-hour shifts that would compound into a wall of exhaustion. He'd routed her through the medication room at 0230 when only the night pharmacy tech was present, when oversight was minimal and documentation could be questioned. She was drawing up insulin for a post-op patient, the syringe held steady against the vial, when Sterling appeared in the doorway like a manifestation of deliberate timing. "Excuse me," he said politely. Rachel recognized the tone. Predatory courtesy. She shifted to let him pass. The movement was minimal, she knew better than to turn, knew better than to break her concentration. But he walked close enough that his arm caught her hand. Not hard. Just a bump. Casual. Accidental. The insulin spilled across her palm. 20 units. Wasted. The protocol required her to dispose of it and document the loss, and documentation left a trail, a record of breakage, of accidents, of a nurse who couldn't keep her hand steady. "Sorry about that," Sterling said. The apology had teeth in it. "Butterfingers, who?" He left before she could respond. Rachel stood at the medication counter, insulin cooling on her skin, and began again. Fresh vial. Steady hands. The muscle memory that came from 18 years of doing things under pressure, in the dark, with lives balanced on the blade of her concentration. The trembling that had threatened earlier, the exhaustion, the violation of it, the deliberate nature of his touch, she locked it into a box and closed the box and filed the box away in a place where it couldn't leak. A nurse practitioner had witnessed it. Rachel saw her at the corner of her vision, saw her look away uncomfortably, saw her decide that whatever she'd just watched was not worth speaking about. Survival hierarchies. Ones that everyone in the hospital understood. That evening, Rachel sat alone in her car in the parking garage. The structure was 7 levels of concrete and shadow, and her vehicle was in a corner where the overhead light had burned out 3 weeks ago. She hadn't reported it. Darkness was useful. Darkness was honest about what the world was made of. Her hands were shaking. They lay on the steering wheel in front of her, trembling with the kind of rage that has nowhere to go, the kind of exhaustion that comes from holding yourself together while someone methodically dismantles you in front of witnesses. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 18 years of protocol and orders and the price of keeping your clearance and the cost of staying invisible. She breathed. 1 cycle. In through the nose. For count. Hold. For count. Out through the mouth. 5 count. Again. She'd learned this in rooms full of operators who'd all served in places that officially didn't exist, and breathing was what kept you from becoming a statistic. 1 minute and 20 seconds. That's how long it took for her hands to stop shaking. By the time she turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the garage, Rachel Torres was steady. Her hands controlled the wheel with precision. Her eyes tracked the evening traffic on Victory Drive with military clarity. Her heart rate had normalized. She didn't yet know that on Friday, that same Navy SEAL, post-operative, still weak from the valve replacement that should have been routine, would begin exhibiting symptoms of a condition that most nurses would overlook because they'd been trained to trust the monitors, to follow protocol, to believe that the surgeons had done their work correctly and that recovery was just a matter of time. She didn't know that Sterling had assigned her to his care deliberately, thinking the deaf patient's communication barriers would expose her incompetence. She didn't know that when his oxygen saturation began dropping, when his chest started to deviate from its axis, when he began to show signs of the tension pneumothorax that was collapsing his right lung, she would have to choose between protocol and the thing she'd been trained for in places that officially never happened. She didn't know that in 48 hours, someone was going to sign a single word that would change everything. But her hands knew. The part of her that was still the person she'd been before the civilian paperwork, before the name and the apartment and the scrubs and the invisible career, that part of her was already preparing. Already calculating. Already moving toward whatever catastrophe Sterling had unknowingly set in motion. The drive home took 17 minutes. Rachel pulled into her apartment complex, climbed the external stairs, unlocked her door, and stood in the darkness of her living room without turning on the lights. She touched the unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one hanging in her locker at the hospital, the one she'd checked Thursday morning like a ritual, like a talisman, like proof that the woman who'd sewn it there was still real somewhere underneath the temp badge and the deference and the calculated invisibility. Muscle memory was a dangerous thing. It remembered when you'd forgotten. It knew what you'd tried to bury. And sometimes, when the pressure built high enough, when the stakes climbed past the threshold of acceptable loss, muscle memory took over completely. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't check the protocol first. It just moved. The cardiac monitor's steady beat became a flatline scream at 6:33 a.m. on Saturday. The deaf Navy SEAL, 63 years old, a man whose name tag read Robert Chen but whose eyes carried the weight of 3 decades in the teens, had checked into Oak Creek Memorial's cardiac recovery unit Friday afternoon following a routine mitral valve replacement. Routine. That word meant nothing to Rachel Torres the moment she saw him. She recognized the particular way he held his shoulders, the faint scar tissue visible along his left forearm, the precision with which he arranged his belongings on the bedside table. This was a man accustomed to control. A man accustomed to surviving. 24 hours post-op, his vitals had been excellent. Oxygen saturation 98% on room air. Heart rate steady at 72. Blood pressure a textbook 118/76. The surgical team had congratulated themselves on a flawless procedure. The valve was in place. The incision was clean. Recovery would be uncomplicated. Rachel knew better than to trust routine. She'd been assigned to his care despite Sterling's attempt to reassign her to the obstetrics ward, a deliberate insult that barely registered anymore. By Friday evening, she'd learned to read Robert Chen in a way that made the monitors seem almost redundant. The slight tension in his jaw when he thought no one was watching. The way his breathing changed during the night hours, shallow and controlled, the breath work of someone trained to remain invisible. His sister had visited in the afternoon, bringing his daughter and a grandchild. Robert had signed with his hands in flowing, precise movements, his daughter interpreting for the nurse who'd stopped by with evening medications. He'd asked about the weather. About traffic. About nothing that mattered. But his eyes had never left Rachel's station at the nurse's desk, watching her move through the unit with the kind of attention reserved for threat assessment. The flat line came without warning. Rachel was charting medication administration when the cardiac monitor transformed from rhythm into noise, that terrible, elongated scream that meant the heart had abandoned its electrical conversation. She was moving before her conscious mind registered the sound, 3 steps to his doorway, 5 steps to his bedside. Robert's eyes were open. Aware. Already knowing something was catastrophically wrong. "Get the crash cart," she said, her voice dropping into that register that made doctors flinch. Not a question. Not a request. The nursing assistant who'd been restocking supplies moved without hesitation. Rachel's hands were already on his chest, palpating, assessing. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, tachypneic, desperate. The left side of his ribcage was hyperresonant to percussion. No breath sounds on the left. The trachea was shifting. Subtle but present. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was creating a one-way valve, air pushing into the pleural space with each breath, compressing the right lung and heart, cutting off venous return. He was drowning in his own physiology. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his face draining of color. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. He was calculating, she could see it, the liability, the lawsuits, the way this would look on his record. The moment stretched like taffy, and Rachel understood that he was frozen the way civilians froze when the world shifted into crisis. He wasn't thinking about Robert Chen. He was thinking about himself. 14-gauge angiocath needle, Rachel said. Now. The crash cart arrived. Someone thrust supplies into her hands. The needle was there, the catheter attached, the plastic hub already warming under her fingers. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. Not in 2024. She'd done this in Sanjin Valley in a forward operating base with mortar fire turning the sky orange, with a Marine whose name she couldn't say anymore because saying it made the weight behind her eyes intensify, with nothing but a needle and muscle memory and the understanding that the next 60 seconds determined whether a man lived or died. Her hands moved on their own. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle went in at a 90-degree angle with practiced precision, pushing through skin and muscle until she felt the resistance change, the sudden give of the pleural membrane. Air hissed out, a sound like a tire deflating, like pressure being released, like physics correcting itself. "Catheters in," she said. The oxygen saturation monitor climbed. 68%. 72%. 81%. The monitor's rhythm began to return, the flat line becoming an irregular pulse, then a coherent sinus rhythm, climbing, stabilizing. Robert's chest rose and fell with something approaching normalcy. His eyes, those eyes that had seen things that made the most terrible moments of her life seem manageable by comparison, locked onto hers with an intensity that transcended shock. She'd just saved his life. Sterling made a sound that might have been a word or might have been the noise of his carefully constructed world reordering itself. The crash cart team stood frozen. The nursing assistant who'd brought the supplies was staring at Rachel's hands as if they belonged to someone else entirely. "We need imaging," Rachel said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Portable chest X-ray to confirm needle placement. Start supplemental oxygen. Get 2 large bore fours running. I'll need a chest tube set up at bedside, 20 French, ready for insertion if we see reaccumulation." She turned to Sterling, who was still occupying the doorway like a man who'd forgotten how to move. "Call thoracic surgery. Tell them we have a post-op cardiac patient with a tension pneumothorax that just got needle decompressed. They're going to want to see him." She didn't wait for his response. The next 2 hours were textbook emergency management. The portable X-ray confirmed the needle placement was perfect, the tip sitting just inside the pleural space, the lung re-expanding beautifully. Thoracic surgery arrived within 23 minutes, assessed Robert's condition, and determined that while a chest tube would be prudent, his oxygenation was stable enough to observe. Rachel had already drawn the labs, ordered the antibiotics, adjusted the medications. By 9:15 a.m., Robert Chen was sleeping, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 96%, his heart rate even, the immediate crisis resolved. But that wasn't the worst part. Sterling emerged from a phone call in the corner of the unit at 11:34 a.m., his face arranged into something approximating professional concern. But Rachel had read men like him before, men whose power came from systems, from allies, from the careful architecture of institutional leverage. She recognized the moment he decided something. Recognized it the way a scout recognizes the moment a predator decides to hunt. By 2 p.m., 2 compliance officers from the hospital's credentialing department were waiting in an administrative office. Rachel was summoned from the floor with no explanation. The office was cold, the kind of institutional cold that came from deliberate underlighting and the absence of anything that suggested humanity. The 2 men in suits sat behind a desk. One of them had a file. "Rachel's file. We need to discuss your credentials," the first officer said. His voice had the particular tone of someone who'd practiced this conversation in a mirror, who'd convinced himself that what he was doing was procedure rather than consequence. Rachel provided her nursing license, her certification, the RN credentials that she'd obtained through legitimate channels, the documentation that proved she was licensed to practice in Georgia, in South Carolina, in 4 states total. All of it was in order. All of it was real. "What about your previous employment?" the second officer asked. "We're trying to verify your background. References. Your work history before Oak Creek Memorial." Rachel's hands, steady enough to perform needle decompression on a dying man, became very still. "My previous employment was military healthcare." "Specific details." "Classified," she said. The word hung in the air like something that didn't belong in this room, that had never been intended for fluorescent lighting and institutional furniture. "I worked in field medicine. Some of those records can't be released through normal channels." The officers exchanged a glance, subtle, practiced, the kind of glance that said they'd been briefed already, that they were conducting this conversation not to discover truth but to create a paper trail. "That's problematic," the first officer said. "We can't credential someone without full employment history verification. It's a liability issue." "I can provide a discharge summary," Rachel said. "An honorable discharge." "References from?" "From where, exactly?" "If the records are classified." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of things that couldn't be explained because they'd been deliberately made unexplainable. Rachel understood then what Sterling had done. He'd taken her strength, the fact that she couldn't talk about Sanjin, couldn't explain the operations, couldn't prove a past that had been deliberately erased, and weaponized it into liability. He'd framed her military background not as achievement but as risk. "Until we can verify your credentials through proper channels," the first officer said, his voice carrying the rehearsed sympathy of someone who wasn't actually sympathetic, "the hospital is placing you on administrative leave. Effective immediately. We'll need you to return your badge." Rachel removed her badge from her pocket. Oak Creek Memorial's logo in faded blue. Her photograph from the first week, a woman who looked like she belonged in a hospital. She set it on the desk. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. But something inside her, something that had held steady through 3 tours and 1,000 moments that would destroy someone else, recognized the moment when the rules changed. "I understand," she said. Robert Chen's sister was in his room when Rachel passed by to collect her belongings. The older woman was agitated, signing rapidly, her hands moving in the particular way that meant she was asking questions that nobody could answer. Through the doorway, Rachel saw Robert's eyes tracking the moment her presence registered. Saw the recognition. Saw something that looked like understanding pass between them, the silent acknowledgement of one person who'd been erased looking at another. The cardboard box she'd brought to work that first week, the one that had held her scrubs, her stethoscope, the laminated unit patch sewn inside her jacket's lining, felt heavier on the drive to the parking lot. Rain had started to fall, the kind of rain that was more drowning than precipitation, drumming against the windshield with the steady insistence of something that wouldn't stop. She found herself at a bus stop near downtown Savannah, the kind of place that attracted people who had nowhere better to be. The cardboard box sat on her lap. Inside it, her stethoscope coiled like a snake in hibernation. Her scrubs, still smelling of antiseptic and the particular staleness of institutional air. The cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nursed" in fading letters. A dying succulent in a plastic pot, its leaves curled like the hands of something surrendering. And the photograph. A team of 8. Sanjin Valley, 2012. 3 of them were smiling. 4 of them were looking at the camera like it was a weapon. One of them, a young corpsman with her eyes, wasn't going home. Rain soaked through her jacket. Mixed with something that might have been tears or might have been just more water. She didn't bother to distinguish anymore. 3 blocks away, in an administrative office at Oak Creek Memorial, Dr. Sterling deleted her personnel file from the digital system and made a note in the hospital's database: temp nurse, credential issues. Contract terminated. Do not rehire. But he didn't delete the security footage. That would be the thing he would regret for the remainder of his career. The footage that showed Rachel's hands moving with such precision that they looked like they belonged to someone else entirely. The footage that showed the moment a man who'd been dying was saved by a woman he somehow recognized, even though they'd never met before. She'd appeared at his bedside with a needle and muscle memory and the kind of competence that couldn't be taught in any hospital in America. The IT administrator, a Marine Corps veteran named Clayton, had already saved every frame. Dr. Sterling's hands shook as he dialed the board chairman from his office, the phone pressed so hard against his ear it left a red mark. His 18-month billing scheme, phantom procedures, inflated codes, insurance payouts that had already bought him a lake house in Tybee Island, was collapsing in real time because of a temp nurse who didn't belong here. A woman with hands steady as a surgical laser and a technique that belonged in a combat zone, not Oak Creek Memorial. He called his contact on the hospital board, a man named Ashford who owed him 3 favors from the shared investment portfolio Sterling had quietly funded. "We have a situation," Sterling said, his voice dropping to the controlled murmur of someone used to being obeyed. "The temporary nursing contractor. Patient safety concerns. Credentials we need to verify." He didn't mention the incomprehensible accuracy of her medical interventions. He didn't mention that the SEAL's vitals had climbed from cardiac arrest to sinus rhythm in 90 seconds. He mentioned liability. That was all Ashford needed to hear. By late afternoon, Sterling had activated the medical director who owed him a favor, a man named Pierce who ran compliance investigations and asked very few questions if the compensation was right. Sterling's narrative was pristine: a nurse with records he couldn't verify, a nursing license that appeared legitimate but required further investigation, questions about her legal authorization to practice in Georgia. "I'm concerned she may have misrepresented her credentials," Sterling said, his voice carrying the gravitas of a physician protecting patient safety. "I need this handled quickly and discreetly." Pierce didn't ask what Sterling actually wanted. The message was clear: remove the nurse, bury the investigation, make it look procedural. By evening, a compliance investigator named Kemp had been assigned to the case, a tired bureaucrat who had processed 100 credentials investigations and would process 100 more. He arrived at Oak Creek Memorial on Sunday morning with a tablet and a prepared list of questions, his presence turning Rachel's employment status from temporary to suspended before she'd even been notified. Rachel stood in the cardiac unit break room when Kemp found her, her scrubs still damp from the emergency. His manner was professionally cold, the tone of someone following protocol without believing in it. "We need to discuss your nursing credentials," he said, producing documentation. Your license appears in the Georgia registry, but we're having difficulty verifying your underlying educational credentials. Where did you obtain your nursing degree? Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She knew what was happening. She'd seen the chain of command activate, the looks from the residents, the sudden distance from nursing staff who'd been friendly, the way Sterling had stared at her from the observation window during her needle decompression like a man watching his world burn. My records are classified, she said quietly. Naval Medical Service. The educational credentials are under seal. Kemp's expression didn't change. That's not possible in Georgia. All nursing credentials must be publicly verifiable. Rachel tried to explain. The words felt impossible even as they left her mouth. There was an operation. Sanjin Valley. My service record was sealed after I testified. She stopped. She could hear how it sounded. Like paranoia. Like conspiracy theory. Like the kind of thing unhinged people said when they were desperate. Testified about what? Kemp asked, his tone making clear he'd already decided this was a problem that required documentation, not answers. Rachel's composure, the thing she'd maintained through every humiliation Sterling had orchestrated, began to fracture. But she didn't let it show. She stood there in that break room that smelled of instant coffee and burnt microwave popcorn, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects, and realized that the truth, the actual documented, classified, sealed truth, sounded like the delusion of someone who'd lost her grip on reality. I can't discuss the details, she said finally. The classification is above my clearance to disclose. Kemp's tablet made a small clicking sound as he documented her refusal to cooperate. I'm placing you on administrative leave pending the completion of this investigation, he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Within 2 hours, Rachel had cleaned out her locker, placed her hospital badge on the supervisor's desk, and stood in the parking lot with nowhere to go. By Sunday evening, the rain had arrived, the kind of Georgia downpour that fell in sheets and made the world look waterlogged and broken. Rachel sat at a bus stop on Victory Drive, a cardboard box balanced on her lap like a casket, her scrubs soaked through and clinging to her body. The box contained everything she'd accumulated in her new invisible life, a dying succulent in a ceramic pot, its leaves curled like hands giving up. A cracked mug from a clinic gift exchange that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a photograph of her SEAL team medic, the one who hadn't made it home from Sanjin, the one she'd held compression on while rounds came in from 3 directions, the one who'd died anyway because 17 miles away and burning fuel time on a helicopter was still too far. She stared at that box. At the dead plant. At the useless mug. At the face of a man she'd failed to save. The rain hammered down like judgment, and for the first time since Dr. Sterling had thrown her charts across the floor, since she'd looked in his eyes and understood that her competence was a threat to his theft, since the SEAL had coded and she'd moved with muscle memory forged in a killing zone thousands of miles away, for the first time, she let herself understand the magnitude of what had just happened. She wasn't a temp nurse anymore. She wasn't anyone. She was a ghost again, erased twice now by institutions that didn't know how to handle the kind of truth she carried. The mug's face stared up at her from the box with cheap cheerfulness. World's Okayest Nurse. She closed her eyes and let the rain wash across her face. She didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury operators couldn't afford. But something inside her, something that had remained steady through Sanjin, through the classified testimony, through months of invisible work at Oak Creek Memorial, began to fracture under the weight of that cardboard box and that photograph and that useless, cracked mug that someone had given her as a joke. Her phone buzzed. A text from the VA hospital, where she'd been volunteering on weekends before all of this. They'd heard about the investigation. They wanted her to know that it wouldn't affect her volunteer status. They were honored to have her. The message felt like a life raft made of tissue paper. She set the phone down on the box and stared out at the rain-soaked street, where headlights moved like ghosts through the downpour. A car pulled up to the stop. The driver rolled down the window. "You waiting for the bus?" "It's not coming." Route suspended for flood damage. Rachel didn't respond. The driver looked at her, soaked through, holding a cardboard box in the rain, and seemed to decide this wasn't a person who wanted to be helped. He drove on. She sat there as the light faded, as the rain continued its assault on the city, as the cardboard box slowly began to disintegrate at the edges. Somewhere in that hospital 16 blocks away, a deaf Navy SEAL was fighting his way through recovery. A man whose life she'd saved. Who didn't know her name. Who would never know that the woman who'd performed the needle decompression, who'd known exactly where to place the needle, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly what to do because she'd done it before in a foreign war zone under mortar fire, that woman had been erased by the system she'd served. The rain continued. The bus never came. And Rachel Torres, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Navy SEAL Team 3, holder of a Navy Cross that she could never publicly claim, sat in the dark with a box of dead plants and cracked mugs and waited for whatever came next. The bus shelter rattled as rain hammered the metal roof. Rachel Torres sat on the bench, the cardboard box on her lap, staring at nothing. The cracked mug inside read "World's Okayest Nurse." A dead succulent. A photograph of her platoon medic, frozen at 23 years old. Her phone buzzed at 11:19 p.m. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But the caller ID showed a Savannah area code with a government prefix she recognized, the kind that didn't appear on regular phone lines. Her hand moved to answer before her mind caught up. There was no hesitation anymore. Years of training had taught her that certain calls required immediate response. A voice on the other end, crisp and military, Senior Chief Torres? This is Admiral Patricia Halloway, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Stand by for a secure conference. The line went dead. Then clicked back to life with multiple voices overlapping. Within 90 minutes, Rachel Torres was in a black SUV, towel-dried, moving through rain-slicked streets toward Oak Creek Memorial. The driver, a woman in a Navy windbreaker with an NCIS badge clipped to her belt, didn't speak. But the presence in that vehicle felt like the weight of a formation moving into position. Monday morning arrived like judgment. The hospital's emergency ethics hearing convened at 7 a.m. in the third-floor conference room. The long walnut table had never seen anything like what was about to unfold. Board members in dark suits. The compliance investigator with his neat stacks of fabricated documents. Dr. Sterling in a navy blazer that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent, already rehearsing his opening statement, the one about unqualified personnel endangering patient safety. What Dr. Sterling didn't know was that the deaf Navy SEAL he'd tried to destroy was walking through the doors right now. Robert Chen moved slowly, his daughter as interpreter at his side, but every inch of him carried the weight of someone who had survived things that would break most people. He wore a button-up shirt because he refused to look weak. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from the concentrated effort of his body still healing. The tension pneumothorax had been close. 3 minutes longer and there would have been no recovery, no hearing, no justice. The board chair gestured him to a seat. Chen nodded and sat directly across from Dr. Sterling, his dark eyes locked and unblinking. Sterling began his statement with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed it dozens of times. His voice carried the smoothness of institutional power. Rachel Torres represented a significant liability to this institution. Her credentials were never properly verified. Her background contains discrepancies that suggest she may not even be licensed to practice nursing in the state of Georgia. We have a responsibility to. Robert Chen lifted one hand. Just one. A single gesture that commanded the entire room into silence. His fingers moved, precise, deliberate, forming one word in American Sign Language. A word that hung in the air like a benediction and an indictment simultaneously. Reaper. His daughter's voice trembled as she spoke it aloud into the silence, Reaper. The room didn't react at first. The word meant nothing to most of them. But Sterling's face drained of color as if someone had opened a valve inside his chest. The compliance investigator's pen stopped mid-note. The board chair leaned forward. Chen's grown son stood from the back of the room. He was tall, military-bearing, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd already made peace with whatever came next. His voice was quiet enough to require absolute silence to hear. "My father wants you to know you're in the presence of Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, United States Navy SEAL Team 3. The words landed like a detonation sequence beginning. A nurse from the VA system stood next, her hand shaking as she held a tablet. Her voice was unsteady. "I accessed Rachel's partially declassified service record through federal channels. This is the official documentation." She read aloud, each word a hammer strike, 2 silver stars. A Navy Cross. Meritorious conduct in counterterrorism operations. Citations for heroism under direct enemy fire. Each medal was separate. Each one its own sentence. Each one expanding the geometry of what the room had been willing to do to this woman. The SEAL's former team leader appeared on video call, a man with the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much and survived anyway. He introduced himself as Commander Marcus Graves, current director of the Navy SEAL Foundation. His voice carried the resonance of someone used to being obeyed. Rachel Torres served as senior medical operator on SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, for 7 consecutive deployments. She dragged wounded men through kill zones in Sanjan Valley while returning fire. She performed emergency interventions that saved lives that should have been lost. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. The Navy Cross isn't given for competence. It's given for extraordinary heroism. An FBI liaison, a woman in a dark suit with a badge on her belt, added her voice to the growing chorus. Senior Chief Torres was placed in modified protective status following her testimony regarding potential war crimes discovered during her final deployment in Helmand Province. Her military records were classified and subsequently heavily redacted to protect ongoing investigations and the individuals who testified against them. Sterling tried to interrupt. His voice cracked on the first word. This is all. The board chair's voice came down like a gavel made of ice. "Dr. Sterling, you will remain silent." But Sterling didn't remain silent. Instead, he made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like bone breaking. He pulled out his phone with fingers that had begun to shake. Before anyone could move, he was swiping frantically, his breath coming in short gasps. His eyes had the wild look of a man watching his entire constructed reality collapse in real time. Security moved toward him, but before they reached him, a voice from the back of the room cut through the chaos. "I wouldn't do that, Dr. Sterling." An IT administrator, a lean man with a Marine's tattoo visible on his forearm, stepped forward holding a tablet. His voice was level as a firing line. "I've been monitoring the hospital security system since Friday evening. When you tried to access the surveillance server remotely 20 minutes ago, I was watching. I preserved every frame. Every single moment." He pressed play. The conference room's wall-mounted screen flickered to life. And what played across that screen was the performance of Dr. Sterling's true self, unfiltered and documented. The tray being deliberately knocked from Rachel's hands. The papers scattered. The charts thrown with practiced contempt. His voice, cold and cutting, "Pick that up, sweetheart." The way his eyes had gleamed with the pleasure of breaking someone who wouldn't break. Gasps around the table. The board members leaning back as if the screen had turned septic. But the IT administrator wasn't finished. His voice continued with the methodical precision of a prosecution. "I've also preserved the audio from the call you made to the compliance investigator on Saturday at 4:32 p.m. Would you like to hear it?" The administrator played the audio. Sterling's voice, confident, strategic, containing one sentence that changed everything. "We need to get rid of her before she notices the billing patterns." The hospital CFO, a woman who'd been sitting quietly in the third seat, went absolutely white. She stood so suddenly her chair fell backward, hitting the floor with a crack. "What billing patterns?" The IT administrator turned to face her directly. "I've been auditing the cardiac unit's procedure codes for the past week. There are 847 phantom procedures billed to insurance over the past 18 months. MRI scans that were never performed. Catheterization procedures coded but never executed. cumulative fraudulent billing of approximately $2.3 million. I've documented everything and submitted it to the State Insurance Fraud Division this morning, along with evidence that Dr. Sterling supervised the coding pattern. The silence that followed was the absence of air in a sealed chamber. Sterling's face cycled through colors, white, then gray, then a shade of yellow that suggested his body was shutting down from the inside out. He tried to speak. "This is a misunderstanding. I can explain." His voice cracked on the last word. Actually cracked, like a boy in puberty, because the weight of what was happening had become too heavy for his vocal cords to carry. The board chair's voice came down with absolute finality. "Dr. Sterling, you are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Legal counsel will be contacting you regarding the hospital's position in the fraud investigation. You will not enter this facility again. Nor will you have access to any patient records, personnel files, or confidential information." Security moved. Sterling didn't resist. There was no resistance left in him. He moved like a man who'd been erased, escorted past nurses he'd humiliated, past residents who'd laughed at his jokes, past the cafeteria where he'd announced his betting pool with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never imagined consequences. Rachel Torres watched from the conference room doorway. Her face showed no triumph. No vindication. No satisfaction. Just the quiet stillness of someone who'd been standing in the rain and was finally allowed to come inside. The board chair turned toward her. "Senior Chief Torres, would you accept the position of Director of the Trauma Department at Oak Creek Memorial? With full authority to restructure the unit, implement new protocols, and hire staff based on competence rather than political favor." Rachel's voice, when it came, carried the weight of 7 deployments and 1 Navy Cross. "Yes." 3 words. That's all it took. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walked through the trauma department, her trauma department now, with a clipboard in one hand and purpose in every movement. Her ID badge read the rank that had always been hers, Senior Chief Petty Officer. The staff greeted her with a respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with earned admiration. On her office wall hung a shadow box containing the faded SEAL Team unit patch that Robert Chen had removed from the inside of his jacket lining and presented to her, the only time she'd ever seen him cry. The deaf SEAL visited monthly. His daughter still interpreted, but the conversations were different now. They talked about Sanjin. About the men they'd known. About survival and purpose. About what it meant to honor the dead by living fully. And in a small classroom at Savannah Community College, Dr. Sterling, now just Sterling, the title stripped away like camouflage from an operative finally captured, taught CPR fundamentals to community college students for $18 an hour. He'd plea bargained the fraud charges, traded cooperation for a reduced sentence, and accepted a lifetime of irrelevance as the price of staying out of federal prison. Rachel Torres, for the first time in more than a decade, was visible. That's what this story teaches us. The ones we underestimate are often the ones carrying the weight of everything. And when you finally meet someone willing to push back against corruption and cruelty with nothing but composure and truth, you're standing in the presence of someone who's already survived worse than anything your small ambitions can inflict. Subscribe for stories of the hidden warriors walking among us. Like this video. And comment, have you ever been underestimated, only to prove someone dead wrong?